After 30 years on this bench, I honestly believed I understood people. I believed I knew what desperation looked like, what temptation could do to a person, and how most people would act when life pushed them to the edge. I thought I had seen enough of humanity to stop being surprised. Then one freezing morning, a little boy walked into my courtroom and proved me wrong in a way I will never forget. He didn't come in with a parent beside him. He didn't come in with a lawyer or even with the confidence of someone who understood why he was there. He came in escorted by a police officer wrapped in a jacket so large it looked like it belonged to someone else entirely, and on his feet were a pair of worn-out sneakers held together with strips of gray duct tape. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He looked cold, tired, and scared, but in his small hands he held something that didn't belong to him, a thick leather wallet stuffed with $10,000 in cash. I have handled cases involving fortunes, fraud, property battles, broken families, and every kind of dispute you can imagine. But there was something about the contrast in that moment that stopped me. A homeless child, shivering in borrowed clothes, standing in court with $10,000 he could have easily vanished with. And what happened because of that wallet became one of the clearest lessons I have ever witnessed about honesty, greed, and the true measure of a human being. Before I tell you how it unfolded, let me say this. In my courtroom, I have always believed that character has nothing to do with the money in your pocket. It does not depend on where you were born, what neighborhood raised you, or how expensive your suit is. Real character reveals itself in the moments when no one would have blamed you for doing the wrong thing. My grandfather came to this country with almost nothing. He worked the docks in brutal weather, carried loads that bent his back, and still went home with his dignity intact. He used to tell me that honesty was the one form of wealth nobody could take from you. I grew up hearing that. I watched a man struggle but never steal. I watched a man go without, but never lie about what was his. That lesson stayed with me, and over the years it became one of the quiet rules I carried into every case. When someone stands in front of me, I try not to see only what they did. I try to see what life has done to them. That morning was one of those bitter November mornings when the cold seems to turn the whole city gray. The calendar was packed with routine matters, minor disputes, small infractions, the usual stream of cases that pass through a courtroom every week. Then the doors opened, and in walked that child. His name was Leo. The police report said he had been sleeping in a subway station for nearly 3 weeks. His hands were trembling when he stood before me, partly from fear, partly from the cold. Inside the wallet he had found were 100 crisp $100 bills, $10,000. And let's be honest for a moment. Most adults, even adults living comfortable lives, would feel temptation if they stumbled onto that kind of money. But this boy had not eaten a warm meal in days. He had no bed, no home, no proper coat, no one standing next to him to protect him. If anyone in this world had an excuse to keep that money, people might say it was him, but he didn't. About an hour into the session, the matter was called. It wasn't a theft trial against the boy. The issue was that the owner of the wallet had filed an urgent complaint, claiming he had been robbed. Officers found Leo near the transit station holding the wallet, and because of the amount of money involved, they brought the matter before the court so the facts could be established clearly. Then I saw the owner. His name was Richard Sterling, a wealthy local real estate developer. He had the look of a man who was used to entering every room as if it belonged to him. His suit was immaculate, custom-fitted, expensive in the kind of way that announces itself without needing labels. He stood there with his phone in one hand, still typing messages, as if the entire matter was an inconvenience beneath him. A freezing child stood only a few feet away, and he barely looked at him. Officer Miller, a man I had known for years and trusted completely, testified first. He said they found Leo sitting under a streetlight in the freezing rain near the station. The child had not spent a single dollar, not one. He hadn't bought food. He hadn't tried to hide. He had been waiting for a patrol car so he could hand the wallet over. That detail stayed with me. A hungry child with $10,000 in his hands sitting in the freezing rain and waiting for the police because he wanted to do the right thing. I looked at Mr. Sterling and told him exactly that. I said, "This boy found your wallet, waited in the cold, and made sure it got back to law enforcement safely." I wanted to believe that would be the moment some gratitude appeared on the man's face. It didn't. Instead, he stepped forward, snatched the wallet from the clerk's table, opened it, and began counting the money right there in front of everyone, slowly, one bill at a time. His thumb moved over those $100 bills as though the only question that mattered was whether this poor child had stolen some of it. He did not thank Leo. He did not ask his name. He did not show a hint of compassion. I let the silence settle in the room. Silence can say more in a courtroom than shouting ever could. After all these years, I've learned that sometimes people reveal themselves most clearly when no one interrupts them. So I watched him count every bill, and inside, I was furious. When he finished, he snapped the wallet shut and muttered, "It's all here," almost sounding disappointed that he had not found a reason to accuse the boy of taking something. I leaned forward and asked him a simple question. I told him a 10-year-old child with no roof over his head had returned $10,000 to him. Did he have anything at all he wanted to say to that child? That should have been the easiest moment of the day. A thank you, a word of praise, some basic human decency. Instead, Richard Sterling reached into the wallet, pulled out a single $20 bill, and tossed it onto the table like he was flipping scraps to an animal. He didn't hand it to Leo. He tossed it. Then he told him to buy himself a hot meal and said he was lucky he was in a hurry, otherwise he might have asked the police to search him for anything else missing. You could feel the shock in the courtroom. My clerk actually dropped her pen. I've seen all kinds of arrogance, but there was something especially ugly about that moment. A man worth millions looking down on a starving child who had just protected $10,000 that did not belong to him. Then I looked at Leo. The boy did not reach for the money. Think about that. He was hungry. He was cold. His shoes were falling apart. $20 could have meant food, warmth, maybe a little relief from the misery of the last few weeks. But he didn't even look at it. He stood there, eyes lifted toward me, as if he understood that accepting it in that moment would be accepting an insult. I struck my gavel once and told Mr. Sterling to pick up his $20 and sit down. I told him not to speak, not to touch his phone, and not to mistake my silence for approval. He looked stunned. Men like that often are when they finally meet a room that cannot be bought. But he did as he was told and went to the front row, angry and embarrassed. Then I turned back to Leo and asked him to step closer. I wanted to know the answer to the question that had been in my mind from the moment he walked in. "Leo," I said, "why didn't you keep it? No one would have known. You could have bought food, clothes, a bed, maybe even disappeared somewhere warm. Why wait in the rain to return it?" The boy looked up at me with those tired, hollow cheeks and cracked lips, and he answered without hesitation. He told me that before his mother died the year before, she had held his hand and said something he must never forget. He said she told him that they might not always have food, they might not always have a warm place to sleep, but they still had their name. And the moment you take what does not belong to you, you lose the only thing that is truly yours. I had to stop for a moment after hearing that. In that child's voice was the kind of truth that makes an entire room go still. I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes. People who watch my courtroom know what that means. It means something has gone straight past the law and into the heart. I looked at Leo, standing there in an oversized jacket and duct-taped shoes, and I thought to myself that I was looking at a child far richer than the millionaire seated a few yards away. Not richer in money, richer in what actually matters. The room was completely silent. Then Officer Miller approached the bench and quietly handed over an evidence bag. He reminded me that when the wallet had been inventoried at the precinct before being released, they found not only the cash, but something else tucked into a hidden compartment, a black USB drive, and a folded sheet of parchment covered in handwritten numbers. I looked at that bag, then I looked at Richard Sterling. The change in him was immediate. All the arrogance disappeared from his face. The color drained from his skin. His hands gripped the bench in front of him. And that was the moment I understood something important. He had not been anxious because of the money. He had been terrified because of whatever else was inside that wallet. I unfolded the papers slowly. I am a deliberate reader, especially when the room needs to feel the weight of what is being uncovered. As my eyes moved across the page, the truth became clear. It was a handwritten ledger. Names, figures, shell companies, bribes, payments, officials, a map of corruption. Millions of dollars routed through illegal channels to push real estate deals through city systems, while safety and ethics were pushed aside. The USB drive, I suspected, held the digital records that backed it all up. Suddenly, the powerful man in the expensive suit was no longer calm. He stood and demanded the wallet and all its contents be returned immediately. He started talking about private property, privilege, who he knew, who he could call. Then, when panic overtook him, he did something even lower. He pointed at Leo and accused the child of tampering with the wallet and stealing from him. Imagine that. A starving 10-year-old who would not touch a single dollar was suddenly being blamed by a man who had likely stolen millions. I told Mr. Sterling that 10 minutes earlier he had stood in my courtroom, counted every dollar in front of us, and declared that everything was there. But now that evidence of his own criminal conduct had surfaced, he wanted to reinvent that same boy as a thief. He opened his mouth to respond, but there was nothing he could say that would not expose him further. By then, Officer Miller had quietly called in additional authorities. An investigator from the State Anti-Corruption Task Force entered the courtroom. It turned out they had been building a case against Sterling's company for over a year. They suspected bribery, kickbacks, corruption in city approvals, but they had never been able to find the master ledger, and there it was, delivered into the hands of justice by a homeless child who had done the right thing simply because his mother had taught him honesty. I watched as the investigator placed handcuffs on Richard Sterling. I watched the man who had tossed a $20 bill at a starving child lose everything in the span of a few minutes. The wallet he had cared about so deeply sat abandoned on the table. All his money, all his status, all his connections, none of it could protect him from the truth once it came into the light. Then I looked back at Leo. He was frightened. Tears were filling his eyes because children in situations like that often assume they must somehow be in trouble. I spoke as gently as I could and told him to look at me. I made sure every person in that courtroom heard what I said next. You are not in trouble, son, not even a little. In fact, what you did today took more courage and honesty than many adults show in an entire lifetime. That man tried to make you feel small, but today you brought down something much bigger than money. When the courtroom finally quieted after Sterling was taken away, I stepped down from the bench. That is not something judges do lightly. But that day did not call for distance. It called for humanity. I walked over to where Leo stood and knelt so I could look him in the eye. His teeth were still chattering. I put a hand on his shoulder and told him the law had taken care of that man. Now it was our turn to take care of him. My clerk was already on the phone contacting family services to arrange emergency placement. Officer Miller took off his own department jacket and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders, and then the rest of the courtroom began to move. A defense attorney came forward and quietly placed money on the clerk's desk. A public defender added more. A woman who had only come in for a traffic matter offered Leo a brand new pair of gloves she had in her purse. Within minutes, people who had entered that room as strangers had come together to make sure that child would eat, would be warm, and would not walk back out into the cold alone. That is what integrity can do. One honest act can wake up the conscience of an entire room. Leo's mother had left him with no house, no savings, no safety net, but she had left him something more powerful than all of that. She had left him a code, a belief, a moral inheritance so strong that even hunger and homelessness could not break it. And that lesson changed everything. The story did not end there. A year later, Richard Sterling's empire had completely collapsed. The evidence recovered from that wallet helped expose a wide network of corruption. Public money was recovered. Officials were prosecuted. Sterling himself ended up serving a long federal sentence. For all the wealth he once had, he lost the things money cannot restore: freedom, reputation, and dignity. But the part of the story that stays with me most is not his downfall. It is what happened to Leo. Months later, the courtroom doors opened again. Officer Miller walked in, this time in plain clothes, beside his wife, and standing between them was Leo. But he was different now. He was no longer swallowed by someone else's jacket. No more duct-taped shoes. No more fearful eyes. He looked like a child should look, safe, steady, warm, and finally able to breathe without fear. Officer Miller and his wife had adopted him. Not only that, but the people who had witnessed that day in court, lawyers, clerks, citizens, had pooled money together and created a trust fund for his future education. Leo walked up to the bench, smiling, and handed me a small handmade note. In the uneven writing of a child, it said, "Thank you for believing me. My mom in heaven is proud." I kept that note. I placed it beside the photograph of my grandfather because both remind me of the same truth. Wealth can buy comfort, it can buy access, it can buy power, appearances, and influence. But it cannot buy character. It cannot buy the kind of integrity a struggling mother passed down to her son. And it cannot buy the peace that comes from knowing you chose what was right when life gave you every reason not to. Leo did more than return $10,000 that day. He returned something far more valuable. He reminded an entire courtroom, and an old judge who thought he had seen everything, that honesty still lives in this world, that dignity can survive poverty, that even in the coldest circumstances, the human soul can remain clean. So if you ever find yourself standing at a crossroads between what is easy and what is right, remember this boy. Don't remember the man with the expensive suit and the thick leather wallet. Remember the child with duct tape on his shoes who had every excuse in the world to keep what wasn't his and still chose honor, because in the end, that choice is what defines us. And after all my years on this bench, I can tell you with absolute certainty that dignity is still the most valuable thing a person can own.